The central courthouse of Ouagadougou was unlike anything the city had witnessed in decades. That crisp morning air carried with it a tension so thick you could almost taste it on your tongue. Outside the imposing colonial-era building, crowds had formed since dawn, their numbers swelling with each passing hour. Some came bearing handmade banners and flags, their voices rising in coordinated chants. Others stood silently, mere spectators to history unfolding before their eyes, unsure of which side to choose in this national drama. Military vehicles lined the perimeter like steel sentinels, their presence a stark reminder that this was no ordinary trial. Commandos in tactical gear stood at every corner, their faces hidden behind dark visors, their automatic weapons held at the ready. Barricades had been erected to keep the masses at bay, yet the energy of the crowd seemed to seep through every barrier, filling the air with an electric anticipation. This was not just a courtroom proceeding, this was history being written in real time, with an entire nation as witness. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was suffocating. The old wooden benches, worn smooth by decades of use, creaked under the weight of journalists, retired military officers, political observers, and ordinary citizens who had fought for hours to secure a seat. The air conditioning struggled against the body heat of hundreds packed into a space meant for far fewer. Yet no one complained. No one dared to leave. Every eye in that room was fixed on a single point, the defendant's chair, and seated in that chair was no ordinary man. This was Ibrahim Traoré, the man Burkina Faso had once celebrated as a hero, a symbol of integrity in a nation weary of corruption. He had entered the courtroom wearing his military uniform, the same one he had worn with pride for over 2 decades. The badges on his shoulders spoke of years of service, of battles fought and won. The silver plate on his chest gleamed under the harsh courtroom lights, a physical manifestation of honor earned through blood and sacrifice. But today, something was different. The confidence that had once radiated from Ibrahim's posture seemed dimmed. His eyes, which had once blazed with conviction and purpose, now carried a heavy burden, the weight of accusations, of betrayal, of a conspiracy that threatened to destroy everything he had built. There was no anger in those eyes, no defiance, only a profound sadness, as if he were mourning not just his own fate, but the fate of the nation he had sworn to protect. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. You could hear the shallow breathing of those in attendance, the soft rustle of papers, the distant hum of the air conditioning unit struggling in vain. 2 police officers flanked Ibrahim as he was escorted to his seat, but there was something peculiar about the way they walked. It was not the triumphant march of law enforcement bringing a criminal to justice. Instead, it felt more like a funeral procession, as if they were leading a fallen hero to his final resting place rather than a traitor to judgment. Ibrahim's mother was notably absent that day. Word had spread quickly through the city that she had fallen ill, confined to her bed by both physical weakness and emotional anguish. Those who knew her said she had not stopped praying since the charges were filed, her frail hands clutching prayer beads as she whispered supplications for her son's deliverance. The thought of her suffering added another layer of grief to the already somber proceedings. Outside, beyond the stone walls and armed guards, a different scene was unfolding. Children, some barely old enough to understand the gravity of the situation, held up crude signs they had made themselves. "Don't punish the honest," read one banner painted in bright red letters. "Hero, not traitor," declared another. These were the children of families Ibrahim had helped during his years of service, children whose fathers he had saved from terrorist attacks, children whose villages he had defended when no one else would. Presiding over this momentous trial was Judge Fatou Sirigua, a woman whose reputation preceded her. In her 25 years on the bench, she had earned respect across the political spectrum for her unwavering commitment to justice. She was known as a judge who could not be bought, could not be intimidated, and would not bend to political pressure. Her gray hair was pulled back in a tight bun, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed the thick file before her. The weight of this case showed in the lines etched deeper into her face. The charges against Ibrahim Traoré were as serious as they were devastating. According to the prosecution's file, he stood accused of leaking classified information about a covert military operation. This leak, they claimed, had resulted in enemy agents escaping justice and, worse still, had led to the deaths of innocent civilians along Burkina Faso's volatile borders. The evidence appeared substantial: server logs, phone records, official military reports, all seemingly pointing to Ibrahim as the source of the breach. In the gallery, retired military officers sat in stunned silence. These were men who had served alongside Ibrahim, who had witnessed his courage firsthand. One grizzled colonel, his chest adorned with medals from conflicts spanning 3 decades, leaned toward his companion and whispered hoarsely, "The world has turned upside down. This boy was once our pride. Now he sits in the defendant's chair like a common criminal. I never thought I would see this day." But his words carried a note of uncertainty. Deep down, many of those who knew Ibrahim struggled to reconcile the man they remembered with the crimes he was accused of committing. How could someone who had sacrificed so much for his country betray it so completely? The journalists represented every major news outlet in West Africa and beyond. This trial had captured international attention. CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera all had correspondents in the courtroom, their cameras rolling, their pens flying across notebooks. One veteran reporter, who had covered Ibrahim's rise to prominence years earlier, sat with his head bowed, unable to watch the proceedings directly. He had once written glowing profiles of Ibrahim's integrity, his commitment to truth and justice. Now he found himself reporting on the man's potential downfall. "The system of justice always weighs heaviest on its own," he muttered to himself, a bitter observation born of decades watching idealistic leaders fall from grace. When Judge Sirigua finally struck her gavel, the sharp crack echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. Every conversation ceased mid-sentence. Every head turned toward the bench. The trial was beginning. Ibrahim sat perfectly still in his chair, his posture military straight despite the circumstances. But his face bore an expression that puzzled many observers. It was not the face of a guilty man trying to conceal his crimes, nor was it the face of an innocent man outraged by false accusations. Instead, there was a strange serenity about him, as if he had already made peace with whatever was about to unfold, as if he knew something the rest of the courtroom did not. In the corner of the room, partially hidden behind a pillar, a young mother held her crying daughter. The child had recognized Ibrahim and kept asking why the man who had saved their family was sitting in that chair. "Mama, isn't that the uncle who helped us?" the girl whispered through her tears. "Why is he here?" The mother's response was heavy with resignation. "Yes, my child. But today, this is all politics. The truth doesn't always matter when power is at stake." That single statement captured the bitter reality that hung over the entire proceeding. This was about more than one man's guilt or innocence. This was about power, about control, about the future direction of an entire nation. And everyone in that courtroom, from the judge to the journalists to the ordinary citizens in the gallery, understood that the verdict reached here would echo far beyond these walls. The first day of testimony was just beginning. But the atmosphere already felt like the climax of a tragedy that had been building for months. Everyone knew they were not just witnessing a trial. They were witnessing a test of their nation's justice system, a test of their ability to seek truth in a world clouded by deception, and perhaps most importantly, a test of whether integrity could survive in a landscape dominated by political machinations. As the courtroom settled into an uneasy quiet, the government prosecutor rose from his seat. He was a man in his 50s, impeccably dressed in a dark suit that spoke of authority and precision. His reputation as a formidable legal mind had been built over decades of successful prosecutions. He had sent dozens of corrupt officials to prison, had dismantled criminal networks, and had never lost a high-profile case. Today, he carried himself with the same confident air, though careful observers might have noticed a slight hesitation in his movements, a momentary pause before he spoke. He arranged his files on the podium with deliberate care, taking a deep breath before addressing the court. "Your Honor," he began, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the packed courtroom. "Today, we stand before you to present evidence against a man who was once celebrated as a hero of this nation. It brings me no pleasure to be here, prosecuting someone who wore the uniform with distinction. But the evidence we will present today is irrefutable. It will demonstrate beyond any reasonable doubt that Ibrahim Traoré has committed the gravest crime imaginable. He has betrayed his country. A wave of whispers rippled through the gallery. People leaned toward each other, exchanging shocked glances and hushed comments. The prosecutor waited for the murmurs to die down before continuing, allowing his words to sink in, to create maximum impact. "The charges are clear and damning," he continued, pacing slowly before the judge's bench. "Captain Ibrahim Traoré, entrusted with the most sensitive military intelligence of our nation, willfully and deliberately leaked classified information about a covert operation. This information made its way into the hands of enemy agents, individuals who pose a direct threat to our national security. As a result of this leak, these agents escaped capture. But that is not the extent of the damage." He paused dramatically, letting the tension build. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Because of this betrayal, dozens of innocent civilians lost their lives along our borders. Families were torn apart. Children were orphaned. Villages that should have been safe became targets. All of this death and suffering can be traced directly back to the information that was leaked. And the evidence points to one man as the source of that leak. The prosecutor lifted a thick manila folder, holding it aloft for everyone to see. This folder contains irrefutable proof. Server logs that show unauthorized access to classified files. Phone records documenting communications with individuals connected to enemy networks. And military reports that establish a clear chain of causation from the leak to the tragic consequences that followed. Judge Siragua adjusted her glasses and gestured for the prosecutor to proceed with his evidence. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as a projector hummed to life. On the large screen mounted on the wall, a detailed map appeared, showing the border regions where the incidents had occurred. Red dots marked locations where enemy agents had been spotted. Blue circles indicated areas where civilians had been killed, and connecting these points were dotted lines representing communication intercepts and intelligence reports. The visual representation was damning. It painted a picture of systematic betrayal that had cost lives. As you can see, the prosecutor continued, using a laser pointer to highlight specific areas of the map. These locations were part of a highly classified operation. Only a handful of people within the military command structure had access to this information. Captain Traoré was one of them. In fact, he was the only person who had access to all of these operational details simultaneously. The prosecutor clicked to the next slide, which showed a list of names, officials who had clearance to access the classified information. Ibrahim's name was highlighted at the top, marked with a yellow star. In the gallery, faces began to harden. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Several people shook their heads in disgust, their body language suggesting they had already rendered their verdict. How could someone entrusted with such responsibility betray that trust so completely? What possible motivation could justify such an act? But others in the crowd wore expressions of doubt and confusion. These were people who knew Ibrahim personally, who had seen him risk his life for others, who had witnessed his unwavering commitment to doing what was right. Could this man really be capable of such treachery? Could honor and integrity be so completely false? The prosecutor advanced to his next piece of evidence, a video testimony from a military intelligence officer. The officer appeared on screen in his uniform, his face stern and uncompromising. He raised his right hand as if taking an oath, then spoke directly to the camera. "My name is Major Amadou Diallo. I have served in military intelligence for 12 years. On March 15th of this year, I personally observed Captain Ibrahim Traoré accessing classified documents related to Operation Desert Shield. This was during the late evening hours when most personnel had left the facility. I thought it unusual but did not initially question it, as Captain Traoré had proper clearance. However, within 72 hours of his access to those documents, the information contained within them appeared in enemy communications that we intercepted. The testimony continued for several more minutes, with Major Diallo providing specific dates, times, and details about the documents in question. His demeanor was professional, his words measured and careful. To anyone watching, he appeared to be a credible witness simply reporting facts. The impact of this testimony was immediate and visceral. Several people in the gallery gasped audibly. A woman in the front row burst into tears. Someone in the back shouted, "Traitor! He should be hanged!" Before being quickly silenced by security personnel, Judge Sirigua struck her gavel forcefully. "Order! I will have order in this courtroom!" One more outburst and I will clear this gallery entirely. We will conduct these proceedings with the dignity and respect that justice demands. The crowd settled back into an uneasy silence, but the damage was done. The prosecution's case was having its intended effect. With each piece of evidence, Ibrahim appeared more guilty, more isolated, more condemned. Meanwhile, Ibrahim himself remained motionless in his chair. His face betrayed no emotion. No surprise at the accusations, no anger at the testimony against him, no fear of the consequences he faced. His eyes stared straight ahead, seeming to focus on some distant point beyond the courtroom walls, as if he existed in a different dimension entirely. This strange calm unnerved many observers. Shouldn't he be defending himself? Shouldn't he be protesting his innocence, demanding to be heard? His silence seemed to confirm what the prosecutor was saying, or did it suggest something else entirely? Something deeper and more complex that no one had yet considered? The media representatives in attendance were working frantically, typing rapidly on laptops, sending real-time updates to their news desks. A television anchor leaned toward her cameraman and whispered, "This isn't just Ibrahim's trial. This is a trial of our nation's integrity, of everything we claim to stand for." Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown even larger. News of the damning testimony spread quickly through social media and word of mouth. Two distinct groups had formed, separated by barriers and police lines. On one side, supporters of Ibrahim held signs declaring, "Our hero is innocent," and "Justice for Traoré." Their chants echoed off the building's stone facade. "Free Ibrahim! Free Ibrahim!" On the other side, an angry mob demanded justice for the victims. Their signs bore messages like "Death to traitors" and "Protect our nation." They, too, chanted loudly, creating a cacophony of conflicting voices that penetrated even the thick courtroom walls. The sound reached those inside, a constant reminder that the entire nation was watching, that this verdict would have consequences far beyond the fate of one man. Burkina Faso itself seemed divided, torn between trust in a man they had long admired and horror at the crimes he was accused of committing. Judge Sirigua instructed the prosecutor to continue. More evidence followed. Forensic analysis of computer systems, communications intercepts, financial records that the prosecution claimed showed suspicious transactions. Each piece of the puzzle seemed to fit neatly into place, building an increasingly compelling case for Ibrahim's guilt. One particularly damaging piece of evidence showed screenshots of a secure messaging application. The prosecution claimed these messages came from Ibrahim's phone, showing communications with an unknown contact. The messages, though carefully worded, seemed to reference classified information and arrange for its transfer. "Note the timestamp here," the prosecutor pointed out. These messages were sent at 11:47 p.m. on March 15th, less than 2 hours after Captain Traoré accessed the classified documents. "And here," he advanced to the next screenshot, "we see confirmation from the recipient that the information was received." The case seemed airtight. Motive, means, and opportunity, all pointing directly at Ibrahim Traoré. As the prosecutor concluded his presentation and returned to his seat, a heavy weight settled over the courtroom. The evidence was substantial, professional, and seemingly irrefutable. But still, Ibrahim sat silent and unmoved. And in that silence, a few perceptive observers began to sense something was not quite right. The evidence was almost too perfect, too neatly packaged, too convenient. In their experience, real crimes rarely left such clear trails. Criminals, especially intelligent ones, tried to cover their tracks. Had Ibrahim really been so careless? Or was something else at play here, something darker and more sinister than anyone had yet imagined? As Judge Sirigua called for a recess, declaring that testimony would continue the following day, the courtroom slowly emptied. But the questions lingered in the air like smoke after a fire, and those questions would only grow more insistent as the trial continued. The second day of the trial dawned gray and overcast, as if the heavens themselves were reflecting the somber mood that had settled over Ouagadougou. If anything, the crowd outside the courthouse was even larger than before, the news of the previous day's damning testimony having spread across the nation overnight. Television broadcasts had replayed the highlights endlessly. Radio call-in shows had been flooded with opinions, the vast majority condemning Ibrahim Traoré as a traitor who deserved the harshest punishment. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Today, many expected, Ibrahim would finally break his silence. Surely he would defend himself, would offer an explanation, would fight back against the accusations that threatened to destroy not just his freedom, but his legacy. His lawyer, a distinguished advocate named Amadou Kouadio, was reputed to be one of the finest legal minds in West Africa. People anticipated fireworks, a vigorous defense that would dismantle the prosecution's seemingly airtight case. Judge Sirigua took her seat precisely at 9 a.m., her punctuality legendary. She surveyed the packed courtroom with a stern gaze before striking her gavel once. "We will continue with testimony. The prosecution may call its next witness." The prosecutor stood and announced, "Your Honor, we call Dr. Emmanuel Caboret, Director of the National Cybersecurity Division." A thin man in his early 40s approached the witness stand. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and carried himself with the cautious precision of someone accustomed to dealing with highly technical matters. After being sworn in, he took his seat and waited for questioning to begin. "Dr. Caboret," the prosecutor began, "can you explain your role in investigating this case?" "Yes," the witness replied, his voice soft but clear. "I was asked by military intelligence to conduct a forensic examination of the computer, systems and networks used to access and potentially disseminate the classified information in question." "And what did your investigation reveal?" Dr. Caboret opened a leather portfolio and consulted his notes. "Our analysis showed that on the night of March 15th, someone using Captain Traoré's credentials accessed the secure server containing Operation Desert Shield files. The login occurred at 9:23 p.m. from a terminal in Building 7 of the Military Intelligence Complex. The session lasted approximately 47 minutes. Can you determine with certainty that it was Captain Traoré who accessed these files?" The technical expert hesitated briefly before responding. "The access was made using his credentials, his username and password. The terminal in question is assigned to him. Additionally, the security cameras in Building 7 show someone matching Captain Traoré's physical description, entering the facility at 9:15 p.m. and leaving at approximately 10:20 p.m. A projector displayed a grainy security camera image showing a figure in military uniform walking down a corridor. The image quality was poor, the figure's face not entirely clear, but the uniform and general build appeared consistent with Ibrahim." The prosecutor smiled slightly. "Let me ask you directly, Dr. Caboret. In your professional opinion, based on 15 years of experience in cybersecurity, could this evidence have been falsified or manipulated?" Dr. Caboret shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Well, theoretically, with sufficient expertise and access, it is possible to manipulate digital evidence. However, our examination of the server logs, backup systems, and security protocols found no indication of tampering. The evidence appears authentic. Appears authentic or is authentic? Based on our analysis, is authentic." This testimony hit like a hammer blow. The courtroom erupted in fresh murmurs. Several jurors in the public gallery nodded grimly, their minds clearly made up. The technical evidence, combined with the eyewitness testimony from the previous day, created a seemingly insurmountable case against Ibrahim. Judge Sirigua allowed the prosecutor to continue with several more technical witnesses, each adding another layer of damning evidence. A phone records expert testified about suspicious communications. A military protocols expert explained how someone in Ibrahim's position could have transmitted classified information without immediate detection. A casualty assessment officer provided heartbreaking details about the civilian deaths that resulted from the compromised operation. Through it all, Ibrahim Traoré sat motionless. His lawyer occasionally leaned over to whisper something in his ear, but Ibrahim's responses were minimal: a slight nod, a shake of his head, nothing more. He appeared to be barely engaged with his own defense, a fact that clearly frustrated his attorney and puzzled everyone watching. Finally, as the morning session drew to a close, Judge Sirigua turned her attention to the defendant. "Captain Traoré," she said, her voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity mixed with sternness, "you have heard serious allegations made against you. You have heard testimony that, if believed, establishes your guilt beyond question. This court now gives you an opportunity to respond. Do you wish to address these charges?" The entire courtroom held its breath. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Reporters leaned forward, their pens poised. Cameras focused intently on Ibrahim's face. The crowd outside pressed closer to the courthouse doors, somehow sensing that something significant was about to happen. Ibrahim slowly rose to his feet. For a moment, he simply stood there, his hands resting lightly on the table before him. He looked at Judge Sirigua, meeting her eyes directly. Then his gaze swept across the courtroom, taking in the prosecutors, the witnesses, the packed gallery, the journalists. His expression remained serene, almost peaceful, as if he were saying goodbye to people he loved. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "Your Honor, I have listened to the testimony against me. I understand the seriousness of these charges. I understand that the evidence presented appears compelling. But at this time, I have nothing to say." The shock that followed these words was palpable. People gasped audibly. Someone in the gallery shouted, "Coward!" before being silenced by security. Judge Sirigua's eyes widened slightly, the only indication of her surprise at this response. "Captain Traoré," she continued, clearly struggling to understand his strategy, "I must advise you that remaining silent when faced with such evidence is extremely unwise. The prosecution has built a substantial case against you. Your failure to defend yourself may be interpreted as an admission of guilt. Are you certain you have nothing to say in your defense?" Ibrahim's lips curved into the faintest suggestion of a smile, sad, knowing, almost mystical in its quality. "I am certain, Your Honor. For now, I have nothing to say. When the time is right, the truth will speak for itself. But that time is not yet." He sat back down and the courtroom exploded into chaos. Reporters rushed to file updates. The prosecutor conferred excitedly with his assistants, clearly seeing Ibrahim's silence as a gift. The defense attorney looked like he might have a stroke. His face flushed with frustration at his client's inexplicable refusal to mount a defense. But a few observers, those who had known Ibrahim longest, saw something different in his demeanor. One retired general, seated in the back of the gallery, leaned toward his companion and whispered, "I served with that man for 15 years. He's not silent out of guilt or fear. There's something else happening here, something we don't understand yet." As the court recessed for lunch, speculation ran wild. Why would an innocent man refuse to defend himself? Why would a guilty man not try to mitigate his sentence by showing remorse or cooperating? Ibrahim's silence made no sense from any conventional legal standpoint. Outside, the television crews interviewed legal experts who unanimously declared that Ibrahim's refusal to defend himself was tantamount to a confession. "No innocent man would remain silent in the face of such evidence," one prominent attorney told the cameras. "His silence speaks volumes. The trial is essentially over." But in a small house on the outskirts of the city, Ibrahim's mother heard this news with a different reaction. Weak with illness, propped up on pillows, she smiled through her tears. "My son is not a traitor," she whispered to the women caring for her. "He is waiting. He has always been patient, always known when to speak and when to remain silent. He is waiting for the right moment. And when it comes, the truth will shine like the sun breaking through clouds." Her faith was absolute, unshakable. While the nation condemned her son, while evidence piled up against him, while even his own lawyer questioned his strategy, she knew, with a mother's intuition, that Ibrahim was playing a deeper game. He was not silent because he had nothing to say. He was silent because the time to speak had not yet arrived. The third day of the trial arrived with an intensity that seemed to pulse through the very streets of Ouagadougou. By now, the case had become an international sensation. News crews from around the world crowded the courthouse steps. The story of a celebrated military hero accused of betraying his nation had captured global attention, and everyone wanted to be present for what many assumed would be the final chapter: Ibrahim Traoré's conviction and sentencing. The prosecution had announced that they would present their final, most damning piece of evidence today. Rumors swirled about what this might be. Some said a confession, others suggested video evidence of the leak itself. Whatever it was, the prosecution's confidence was absolute. They had already built an overwhelming case. This final evidence would be the nail in the coffin. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation. Every seat was filled with people standing along the walls and in every available space. Security had been doubled, with armed guards stationed throughout the building. Outside, the crowds had swelled to unprecedented numbers, thousands of people. Divided into factions, their competing chants creating a wall of sound that penetrated even the courthouse's thick stone walls. Judge Siragua called the court to order with 3 sharp strikes of her gavel. "We will hear the prosecution's final evidence," she announced. "Proceed." The prosecutor stood with barely concealed triumph. "Your Honor, over the past 2 days we have presented overwhelming evidence of Captain Traoré's guilt. Today, we will present testimony from his direct superior officer, the man who worked most closely with him on classified operations. This testimony will eliminate any remaining doubt." He gestured toward the courtroom doors, and a tall, distinguished military officer entered. Colonel Mathieu Sankara was a legend in Burkina Faso's military. Decorated, respected, and known for his uncompromising dedication to national security, his presence gave the prosecution's case even more credibility. After being sworn in, Colonel Sankara sat ramrod straight in the witness chair, his uniform immaculate, his bearing that of a career soldier. He did not look at Ibrahim, keeping his eyes fixed forward. "Colonel Sankara," the prosecutor began, "how long have you known Captain Traoré?" 12 years. He served under my command in various capacities. "And during that time, would you say you developed an accurate assessment of his character?" "I believed so, yes." The colonel's jaw tightened. "I trusted him completely." "That trust, I have learned, was misplaced. Can you describe the events surrounding Operation Desert Shield?" Colonel Sankara took a deep breath. Operation Desert Shield was one of our most sensitive operations, a coordinated effort to apprehend a network of individuals suspected of planning attacks on civilian targets. Only 5 officers had full knowledge of the operational details. Captain Traoré was one of them. I personally briefed him on the specifics because I trusted his discretion and expertise. And what happened? 3 days before the operation was scheduled to execute, our intelligence intercepted communications indicating that our targets had been warned. They fled their locations hours before our forces arrived. The operation was a complete failure. More than that, in their escape, the suspects attacked a civilian convoy, killing 17 people, including 6 children. The courtroom fell deathly silent. The weight of those words, 17 people, 6 children, hung in the air like a physical presence. "Based on your investigation, who leaked the information?" Colonel Sankara's face was granite. "All evidence points to Captain Traoré. He was the only person who accessed the complete operational file in the days before the leak. His computer activity, his movements, his communications, everything aligns with the timeline of the breach. Do you believe Captain Traoré is guilty of these charges?" For the first time, the colonel's composure cracked slightly. His voice, when it came, was heavy with emotion. "I do not want to believe it. This man saved my life once. He was like a son to me, but the evidence is irrefutable. Yes, I believe he is guilty, and that belief breaks my heart." This testimony devastated the courtroom. If even Colonel Sankara, Ibrahim's mentor and friend, believed he was guilty, what hope was there? People in the gallery openly wept. Several of Ibrahim's former comrades who had come to support him sat with heads bowed, unable to reconcile what they were hearing with the man they thought they knew. The prosecutor returned to his seat, satisfaction evident in his bearing. "Your Honor, the prosecution rests. We have proven beyond any shadow of doubt that Captain Ibrahim Traoré betrayed his nation, leaked classified information, and bears direct responsibility for the deaths of innocent civilians. We ask that the court render a verdict of guilty on all charges. Judge Sirigua looked toward the defense table. Does the defense wish to present any evidence or testimony? Ibrahim's lawyer stood slowly. Throughout the trial, he had been visibly frustrated by his client's refusal to cooperate with his defense. Now he looked defeated. Your Honor, I have advised my client repeatedly to mount a vigorous defense. He has declined to do so. I have prepared witnesses who could speak to his character, his service record, his history of integrity. He has refused to allow me to call them. He paused, struggling with professional ethics and personal bewilderment. I have no evidence to present because my client has chosen silence. Captain Traoré, Judge Sirigua addressed Ibrahim directly. This is your final opportunity. Will you defend yourself? Will you offer any explanation for the evidence against you? Every eye in the courtroom fixed on Ibrahim. The journalists leaned forward. The cameras zoomed in. Outside, the crowd pressed closer to the doors, somehow sensing this was a pivotal moment. Even those who had condemned him felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps now, finally, he would explain himself. Ibrahim rose slowly to his feet. The simple act seemed to take great effort, as if he carried an enormous weight. He stood in silence for a long moment, his eyes sweeping across the courtroom one final time. Then, to everyone's shock, he reached up and began unbuttoning his military jacket. The action was so unexpected, so strange, that no one knew how to react. Judge Sirigua looked confused. The prosecutor half rose from his seat, uncertain if this was some kind of demonstration. Security guards tensed, hands moving toward their weapons, but Ibrahim's movements were slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. He removed each button with care, as if saying goodbye to something precious. When he finally slipped the jacket from his shoulders and held it in his hands, tears were streaming down his face, the first emotion he had shown throughout the entire trial. He placed the jacket carefully on the table before him and looked up at the judge. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion, but perfectly clear. Your Honor, today I stand before you not as a general, not as a soldier, not as a man of any rank or position. I stand as a son, the son of this nation, the son of a mother who taught me that truth matters more than life itself. I stand as a human being who refuses to hide the truth any longer, regardless of the consequences. He reached beneath his shirt and pulled out a small digital recorder. The courtroom collectively held its breath as he placed it on the table. This, Ibrahim said, his voice gaining strength, contains the truth that has been hidden from this court, from this nation, from all of you. The evidence presented against me is not false. It is meticulously crafted. The testimonies you have heard are not lies. They are carefully orchestrated. I have been silent not because I am guilty, but because I knew that without proof, my words would mean nothing. I have endured your judgment, your condemnation, your hatred, waiting for this moment. The moment when the truth could no longer be suppressed. He pushed the recorder toward Judge Sirigua. On this device are recordings that will reveal the conspiracy behind these charges. Recordings of conversations between high-ranking officials planning my destruction. Recordings that prove I was framed, systematically and deliberately, because I discovered something they could not allow to be revealed. The courtroom exploded in chaos. People shouted questions. Reporters rushed toward the front. Judge Sirigua struck her gavel repeatedly, calling for order. The prosecutor was on his feet, objecting vehemently. Security guards moved to contain the crowd. But through it all, Ibrahim stood calmly, his military jacket laid before him like a discarded symbol of everything that had been taken from him. His mother's prayers, his years of silent suffering, his faith in eventual vindication, all of it had led to this moment. Play the recording, Ibrahim said simply. And then you will know the truth. Then you will understand why I have been silent. Then you will see that the real traitors are not in this defendant's chair. They are watching from positions of power, hoping desperately that I will be convicted before their conspiracy is exposed. Judge Sirigua held the small recorder in trembling hands. The fate of a man, the integrity of a nation's justice system, and the truth of a vast conspiracy all rested in this small device. The courtroom had descended into pandemonium. Voices overlapped in a cacophony of shock, disbelief, and demands for explanation. Some people were standing on benches trying to get a better view. Reporters shouted questions at Ibrahim, at the judge, at anyone who might provide clarity. The prosecutor was arguing loudly that the recorder should be inadmissible, that proper chain of custody had not been established, that this was a desperate ploy by a guilty man. Judge Siragua struck her gavel with such force that it echoed like thunder. "Silence!" Her voice, rarely raised, cut through the chaos with the authority of someone who had presided over courtrooms for a quarter-century. "I will have order, or I will clear this courtroom entirely and continue in closed session. The choice is yours." The crowd reluctantly settled, though the tension in the air was electric. Every eye remained fixed on the small digital recorder sitting before the judge. It seemed almost impossible that something so tiny could contain evidence powerful enough to overturn everything they had witnessed over the past 3 days. "Your Honor," the prosecutor interjected, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "I must object in the strongest possible terms. This alleged evidence has not been properly authenticated. We have no way of knowing when these recordings were made, if they have been edited, or even if they are genuine. This is a transparent attempt by the defendant to create doubt at the 11th hour." Judge Siragua considered this objection carefully. "Counselor, you raise valid concerns. However, this court is dedicated to seeking truth above all else. I will listen to these recordings. If they appear to be authentic and relevant, I will order them to be examined by independent forensic experts. If they prove to be fabricated or irrelevant, they will be discarded, and this trial will proceed to verdict." "Does the defense have any objection to this procedure?" Ibrahim's lawyer, still recovering from his shock at this unexpected development, shook his head. "No objection, Your Honor. We welcome any independent verification of the recording's authenticity." "Very well." Judge Siragua carefully connected the recorder to the courtroom's audio system. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as she prepared to press play. She looked at Ibrahim one final time. "Captain Traoré, I hope for your sake that what we are about to hear justifies your conduct throughout this trial. Proceed." The judge pressed play, and the courtroom fell into an absolute silence so profound that people could hear their own heartbeats. For a moment there was only static. Then voices emerged from the speakers, clear, distinct, and chillingly familiar. The first voice was that of a man speaking with the confidence of someone accustomed to wielding power. Several people in the courtroom recognized it immediately, their eyes widening in shock. It was General Francois Ouedraogo, the chief of military intelligence, one of the most powerful figures in Burkina Faso's defense establishment. "We need to neutralize Traoré," the recorded voice said matter-of-factly. "He's getting too close to discovering our arrangement with the contractors. If he continues investigating the procurement fraud, everything we've built will collapse." A second voice responded, this one belonging to someone not present in the courtroom, but whose identity would soon become apparent. "Can't we just reassign him? Send him to some remote post where he can't cause trouble?" General Ouedraogo's laugh was cold and humorless. "Traoré isn't the type to give up. He believes in that antiquated notion of duty and honor. No, we need something more permanent. We need to destroy his credibility so thoroughly that even if he tries to expose us, no one will believe him." "What do you propose?" "A setup. We leak classified information ourselves and make it appear that he was the source. Choose an operation where the consequences will be severe, civilian casualties if possible. The more tragic the outcome, the more the public will demand his head. Once he's convicted of treason, he'll be finished. Even if he tries to talk, he'll just be a disgraced traitor making wild accusations." The third voice on the recording, identified by some as belonging to a senior government official, sounded hesitant. "That's a dangerous game. Traoré has friends, supporters, people who trust him. Which is precisely why we need to do this," General Ouedraogo replied smoothly. "His reputation makes him dangerous to us, but that same reputation will make his fall even more devastating. The higher the pedestal, the harder the crash. People love seeing heroes brought down. It confirms their cynicism about integrity and honor." The recording continued, detailing the conspiracy in horrifying specificity. They discussed how they would fabricate server logs, how they would create false communications records, how they would ensure that eyewitness testimony corroborated their manufactured evidence. They even discussed the civilian casualties as an acceptable cost of ensuring the frame job would be convincing. The beauty of it, General Ouedraogo's voice continued, is that we're using real classified information. We leak it ourselves through secure channels, ensure our assets escape, and then attribute the leak to Traoré. We control the investigation, we control the evidence, and we control the narrative. He won't have a chance. As the recording played, the atmosphere in the courtroom transformed from shocked silence to horror to outrage. People's faces reflected their evolving understanding. This was not just about one man being framed. This was about systemic corruption at the highest levels, about officials willing to sacrifice civilian lives to cover up their crimes, about the complete perversion of justice. The prosecutor's face had gone ashen. He sank slowly into his chair, realizing that he had been used as an unwitting instrument of this conspiracy. Every piece of evidence he had so confidently presented, every witness he had called, all of it had been orchestrated by the very officials he served. Colonel Sankara, who had testified against Ibrahim with such conviction, sat frozen in the witness chair, his face a mask of horror. His testimony, his certainty of Ibrahim's guilt, he now understood that he too had been manipulated. Fed false information, turned into a weapon against an innocent man. The recording continued for nearly 30 minutes, laying bare the entire conspiracy in devastating detail. It included discussions about the procurement fraud that Ibrahim had been investigating, a scheme involving military equipment contracts worth hundreds of millions, with kickbacks flowing to officials at every level. Ibrahim had discovered irregularities and had been preparing a report. The frame job was designed to silence him before he could expose the corruption. When the recording finally ended, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of what they had just heard was too enormous to process immediately. Judge Sirigua sat with her head in her hands, visibly shaken. In all her years on the bench, she had never encountered anything like this. She had presided over this trial with the utmost seriousness, believing she was administering justice. Instead, she had nearly been an accomplice to one of the gravest miscarriages of justice in the nation's history. Finally, she looked up at Ibrahim, who stood quietly beside his table, tears still streaming down his face. "Captain Traoré," she said, her voice hoarse with emotion, "how long have you had this recording?" "Since before the charges were filed, Your Honor. I recorded it during a meeting I was not supposed to attend. I had returned to the building to retrieve some documents and overheard this conversation in General Ouedraogo's office. I immediately understood that I was in danger, that they were planning something against me. So I recorded it, made multiple copies, and waited. Why didn't you come forward immediately? Why allow yourself to be arrested, tried, and nearly convicted?" Ibrahim wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Because, Your Honor, I needed the conspiracy to fully play out. If I had revealed this recording immediately, they would have claimed it was edited, taken out of context, or fabricated entirely. They would have used their power and influence to discredit it. But by allowing them to proceed with their plan, by letting them present all their manufactured evidence, I have demonstrated the full extent of their capabilities and their willingness to pervert justice. Now, when this recording is examined by independent experts, as I insist it must be, it will be corroborated by all the evidence they themselves created. Their own fabrications will prove the conspiracy. The logic was undeniable, but the cost had been immense. Ibrahim had endured 3 days of testimony against him, had watched his reputation destroyed, had seen the nation turn against him, all while possessing proof of his innocence. The strength required for such patience was almost incomprehensible. "There's another reason I waited," Ibrahim continued, his voice growing stronger. "I needed this to be public. If I had simply taken this recording to my superiors in private, it might have been suppressed, buried, or used to negotiate quiet retirements for the guilty parties. But now, with the entire nation watching, with international media present, there can be no cover-up. The truth is out, and it cannot be put back in the box." Judge Sirigua nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom and the sacrifice of his strategy. This court will immediately order an independent forensic examination of this recording. We will also launch a full investigation into the allegations it contains. In the meantime, she paused, seeming to struggle with her emotions. In the meantime, Captain Traoré, I cannot express the depth of my regret that you have been subjected to this ordeal. While we await verification of this evidence, this court is inclined to release you on your own recognizance. No, Your Honor, Ibrahim said quietly. I ask that I remain in custody until the recording is verified. I do not want anyone to claim that I fabricated evidence to escape justice. Let the truth be established beyond all doubt before I am freed. This statement stunned everyone present. What innocent man, given the opportunity for freedom, would choose to remain imprisoned? But those who knew Ibrahim best understood. This was not about his personal liberty. It was about ensuring that justice was served, that the truth was established so completely that it could never be questioned. Outside the courthouse, news of the recording spread like wildfire. The crowds that had been calling for Ibrahim's execution suddenly fell silent, confused and ashamed. How had they been so quick to condemn a man who had served them faithfully? How had they allowed themselves to be manipulated? In her small house on the city's outskirts, Ibrahim's mother heard the news and wept, not tears of sorrow, but of relief and vindication. I told them, she whispered to the women gathered around her bed. I told them my son was innocent. I told them the truth would come out. Allah has answered my prayers. The television news broke away from regular programming for emergency broadcasts. Anchors struggled to make sense of what had transpired. Legal experts who had confidently predicted Ibrahim's conviction just hours earlier now fell over themselves to explain how such a massive conspiracy could have succeeded so completely until this moment, and, in offices throughout the military and government, certain officials began to panic. Phone calls were made, meetings hurriedly arranged, escape plans contemplated. They knew that the recording was authentic. They had been present for those conversations. And they knew that their time was running out. The following days transformed the trial into something unprecedented in Burkina Faso's legal history. What had begun as the prosecution of a decorated soldier for treason became an investigation into systemic corruption. At the highest levels of government and military, Judge Siregwa ordered the courtroom sealed while independent forensic experts from 3 different countries examined Ibrahim's recording. She wanted no possibility that accusations of bias or manipulation could undermine the findings. For 2 days, while the nation held its collective breath, these experts subjected the digital evidence to every test available to modern forensics. During this time, Ibrahim remained in custody as he had requested, though his conditions improved dramatically. He was moved from the detention center to house arrest in a secure military facility, with full access to his lawyers and regular visits from family, including his mother, who was brought to see him despite her illness. When they embraced for the first time since the trial began, both wept openly. You carried the weight of the world, my son, she told him, cupping his face in her frail hands. You carried it alone and you never faltered. Your father would be so proud. I learned from you, mother, Ibrahim replied. You taught me that truth is patient, that it waits for its moment, and that moment always comes. Meanwhile, the forensic experts completed their analysis and presented their findings to Judge Siregwa in a sealed session. Their conclusion was unequivocal. The recording was authentic, unedited, and matched voice pattern analysis of the individuals purportedly speaking. The metadata confirmed when it was created, and technical examination found no evidence of digital manipulation. But the experts went further. At Ibrahim's suggestion, they compared the recording's revelations about how evidence would be fabricated with the actual evidence presented at trial. The correlation was perfect. Every piece of evidence against Ibrahim matched the conspiracy's description of what they planned to create. The server logs, the communications records, the eyewitness testimonies, all of it followed the blueprint laid out in the recording. It was, as one expert noted, the most comprehensive self-incriminating evidence we have ever examined. The conspirators essentially provided a confession of what they planned to do, and then the evidence shows them doing exactly that. When court reconvened on the 6th day after Ibrahim's revelation, The courthouse was under unprecedented security. General Francois Ouedraogo had been arrested, along with 7 other high-ranking military and government officials. Arrest warrants had been issued for 5 more who had fled the country. The scandal had toppled the government, with the Prime Minister announcing his resignation and calling for new elections. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with thousands more watching on screens outside and millions viewing television broadcasts across the nation and around the world. This was no longer just about Ibrahim Traoré. It was about whether a nation's justice system could hold its most powerful accountable. Judge Sirigua entered the courtroom and waited for silence before speaking. When she did, her voice carried the weight of history. This court has reviewed the forensic analysis of the recording presented by Captain Ibrahim Traoré. The expert's conclusion is unanimous. The recording is authentic and unaltered. Moreover, the content of that recording provides compelling evidence that the charges against Captain Traoré were fabricated as part of a criminal conspiracy. She paused, letting her words sink in. This court finds that the prosecution's case was built entirely on evidence that was manufactured for the purpose of framing an innocent man. The testimonies presented were based on false information fed to well-meaning witnesses. The digital evidence was created by individuals with access to secure systems who used that access not to serve their nation, but to betray it. The judge's voice grew stronger, more forceful. "Captain Ibrahim Traoré, please stand." Ibrahim rose, flanked by his lawyers. For the first time in days, he wore his military uniform again, not because he had to, but because he chose to. He stood straight and tall, his bearing that of a soldier awaiting orders. "This court hereby dismisses all charges against you with prejudice. Furthermore, this court formally apologizes on behalf of the justice system of Burkina Faso for the ordeal you have endured. You have demonstrated extraordinary courage, patience, and faith in the ultimate power of truth. You preserved evidence at great personal risk, and you endured public condemnation and the destruction of your reputation rather than compromise the investigation of those who sought to destroy you." Judge Sirigua's voice cracked slightly with emotion. "Your actions in this matter reflect the highest traditions of military service and civil duty. While we cannot return to you the days you spent in custody or erase the pain you have suffered, we can ensure that the historical record reflects the truth. You are not only innocent, you are a hero in the truest sense of the word." The courtroom erupted in applause and cheers. People who had condemned Ibrahim days earlier now wept with shame and relief. Reporters rushed to file their stories. Outside, the crowds roared their approval, the sound echoing through the streets of Ouagadougou like thunder. But Judge Sirigua was not finished. She struck her gavel, calling for order once more. "This court also orders that immediate criminal proceedings be initiated against General Francois Ouedraogo and his co-conspirators on charges of conspiracy, fraud, corruption, obstruction of justice, and treason. The evidence presented by Captain Traoré provides probable cause for these charges and more." She turned to address the prosecution table, where the chief prosecutor sat looking shattered. "Counselor, you and your team acted in good faith based on evidence you believe to be genuine. You are not culpable for this miscarriage of justice. However, I am ordering a comprehensive review of all military justice procedures to ensure that such manipulation can never occur again." Finally, Judge Sirigua addressed the courtroom as a whole. "Let this case serve as a reminder that justice is not merely about procedures and evidence. It is about the constant vigilance required to prevent those with power from abusing that power. It is about the courage to question even when questioning is uncomfortable. And it is about the recognition that a nation's true strength lies not in the perfection of its institutions, but in its willingness to confront and correct their failures." With one final strike of her gavel, she declared, "This court is adjourned." In the days and weeks that followed, Burkina Faso underwent a transformation that few could have predicted. The trial had exposed not just a single conspiracy, but deep systemic corruption that had been hidden for years. Ibrahim's investigation into procurement fraud, the investigation that had made him a target, was reopened and expanded. What investigators discovered was staggering. General Ouedraogo and his co-conspirators had been stealing from the military budget for over a decade, enriching themselves through inflated contracts, ghost soldiers on the payroll, and equipment purchases that were never delivered. The total amount stolen was estimated at over $800 million, money that should have gone to protecting the nation and its people. The scandal reached into every level of government. Ministers resigned. Generals were arrested. Business executives who had participated in the scheme fled the country or turned state's evidence hoping for leniency. It was the largest corruption investigation in Burkina Faso's history, and at its center was the man who had nearly been destroyed for discovering it. Ibrahim himself became a figure of almost mythical status. The story of how he had endured false accusations, remained silent while possessing proof of his innocence, and ultimately exposed a vast conspiracy, captured the imagination of people around the world. He received invitations to speak at universities, to testify before international bodies, to tell his story to audiences eager to hear about courage and integrity. But Ibrahim declined most of these invitations. He returned to his work quietly, accepting a new position overseeing the reform of military procurement procedures. He insisted that he was not a hero. He had simply done his duty as he understood it. The real heroes, he said in one of his rare public statements, were the civilian victims who had died as a result of the conspirators' scheme, and the soldiers who served honestly despite the corruption around them. His mother recovered from her illness, strengthened perhaps by the relief of seeing her son vindicated. She gave a single interview to a national newspaper in which she said simply, "I never doubted him. A mother knows her child's heart. All I did was pray and wait for Allah to reveal the truth. The waiting was hard, but faith carried me through." Colonel Sankara, who had testified against Ibrahim believing he was doing his duty, sought out his former protege and asked for forgiveness. The meeting between them was private, but those who saw them emerge said both men had tears in their eyes. Ibrahim later stated that Colonel Sankara was as much a victim as anyone, a good man manipulated by those he trusted, the prosecution team that had built. The case against Ibrahim underwent their own form of redemption. They became fierce advocates for judicial reform, using their experience to identify weaknesses in the system that had allowed them to be used as instruments of injustice. The chief prosecutor dedicated the remainder of his career to creating safeguards against manufactured evidence and ensuring that defendants had better protection against powerful conspiracies. As for General Ouedraogo and his co-conspirators, they faced trial themselves in the same courtroom where they had attempted to destroy Ibrahim. The proceedings were swift and thorough. Faced with Ibrahim's recording, with forensic evidence of their fraud, and with testimony from dozens of witnesses they had manipulated, they had little defense to offer. General Ouedraogo received a sentence of 30 years in prison, with no possibility of parole. His co-conspirators received similar sentences. Their property was seized to help compensate the military budget they had plundered, but no amount of money could restore the lives lost as a result of their conspiracy. The civilians killed when the operation was compromised. The soldiers who had died using faulty equipment purchased through their fraudulent contracts. In a symbolic gesture, the government established a memorial to those victims, and Ibrahim attended its dedication. He stood before the gathered crowd, many of whom had called for his execution just weeks earlier, and spoke about the importance of remembering those who suffered when justice failed. These people died because those in power forgot that their duty was to serve, not to enrich themselves, he said. Their deaths are a reminder that corruption is not a victimless crime. Every dollar stolen from the military budget is a dollar not spent on protecting our people. Every contract awarded through bribery is equipment that might fail when soldiers need it most. We honor these victims not just by remembering them, but by ensuring such corruption never happens again. The speech was vintage Ibrahim, simple, direct, focused not on his own suffering but on the broader implications for the nation. It cemented his reputation as a man of genuine integrity, someone who had endured extraordinary hardship, not for personal glory, but out of commitment to principles larger than himself. 5 years after the trial, Ibrahim Traoré sat in his modest office, reviewing reports on the reformed military procurement system. The changes he had helped implement were working. Corruption had not been eliminated entirely, but it had been dramatically reduced. More importantly, there were now mechanisms for whistleblowers to report problems without fear of retaliation, and multiple layers of oversight to prevent any single individual or group from controlling the system. A knock on his door interrupted his work. A young lieutenant entered, looking nervous. "Sir, there's something I need to report. I've discovered some irregularities in a supply contract. Nothing massive, but it doesn't look right." Ibrahim smiled and gestured for the lieutenant to sit. "Tell me everything. And don't worry, in this office asking questions is not just accepted, it's expected." As the young officer explained what he had found, Ibrahim listened carefully, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. This was what he had fought for, not his own vindication, but the creation of a system where integrity was valued, where those who spoke truth were protected rather than persecuted. Later that evening, as he drove home through the streets of Ouagadougou, Ibrahim passed the courthouse where his trial had taken place. A historical marker had been installed, commemorating what had transpired there. Tourist buses sometimes stopped so visitors could take photos. The trial had become part of the nation's story, a reminder of how close they had come to a grave injustice and how one man's courage had prevented it. But Ibrahim rarely thought about those dramatic days anymore. He had never sought to be a hero, and the attention made him uncomfortable. What mattered to him was the quiet work of building better systems, mentoring younger officers, and ensuring that the sacrifice of those who had died was not in vain. His mother had passed away 2 years after his vindication, dying peacefully in her sleep with Ibrahim holding her hand. Her last words to him were simple. "You made your father proud. You made me proud. Now live, my son. Live fully and continue to serve with honor." He tried to honor that wish. He remarried. His first wife had divorced him during the trial, unable to withstand the pressure and shame. His new wife was a teacher who admired him not for his fame, but for his character. They had a daughter now, and Ibrahim delighted in being an ordinary father, attending school plays and helping with homework. Yet his legacy extended far beyond his personal life. The trial had inspired a generation of young people in Burkina Faso and beyond. Universities taught case studies about his ethical decision-making. Military academies used his example when discussing the importance of integrity. His face appeared on murals in cities across the nation, often accompanied by quotes from his testimony, "Truth is patient," and "Duty is heavier than mountains." The recording that had saved him, that small digital device that contained such explosive evidence, was preserved in the National Archives, a physical reminder of how close the truth had come to being silenced forever. Scholars and journalists had analyzed every word, every inflection, marveling at how such a small thing could have such enormous impact. But perhaps the most significant legacy was the broader change in Burkina Faso's culture. The trial had forced a national conversation about corruption, about the abuse of power, about the importance of institutional safeguards. It had shown that even the most powerful could be held accountable, that even the most elaborate conspiracies could be exposed. That truth, however long suppressed, would eventually prevail. Ibrahim himself remained humble about his role. When asked about his decision to remain silent during the trial, to endure condemnation while possessing evidence of his innocence, he would simply say, "I did what needed to be done. Anyone in my position would have done the same." But those who knew him understood that this was not true. Most people, faced with such circumstances, would have acted differently. They would have revealed the recording immediately, or fled the country, or accepted a plea bargain, or broken under the pressure. Ibrahim's strength lay precisely in his willingness to endure suffering for a larger purpose, to sacrifice his reputation temporarily to ensure that justice would be served permanently. As the sun set over Ouagadougou on that evening, 5 years after his vindication, Ibrahim stood on his balcony watching the city lights come on one by one. He thought about the journey he had traveled, from celebrated hero to accused traitor to vindicated whistleblower. He thought about the people who had stood by him and those who had condemned him. He thought about the victims whose deaths had weighed on him throughout the trial, knowing that his silence might be interpreted as guilt when he was actually fighting for justice on their behalf. And he thought about his mother's prayers, offered in faith during his darkest hours. She had never doubted, never wavered, never stopped believing that truth would prevail. Her faith had sustained him when his own strength faltered, had reminded him that patience and integrity were not weaknesses, but the strongest weapons against corruption and deceit. A gentle breeze stirred the air, carrying with it the sounds of the city, children playing, vendors calling out their wares, the distant sound of music from a celebration. Life continuing as it always did, with all its complexity and contradiction. Ibrahim smiled to himself. He had not chosen to become a symbol or a hero. He had simply chosen to do what was right, even when the cost was almost unbearable. And in the end, that choice had made all the difference, not just for him, but for an entire nation learning to value truth over power, integrity over expediency, and justice over convenience. The trial was over, but its lessons endured. And that, Ibrahim reflected, was exactly as it should be. Heroes come and go, but principles, when defended with courage and maintained with patience, become the foundation upon which just societies are built. He turned from the balcony and went inside, where his daughter was calling for him to read her a bedtime story. This, too, was important, perhaps more important than all the rest. Because ultimately, the battle against corruption, the fight for justice, the defense of integrity, all of it was about creating a world where children could grow up safe, where they could trust in the fairness of their institutions, where they could believe that truth mattered and that good people who did right would be protected. That was the world Ibrahim Traoré had fought to preserve. And every day, in small ways and large, he continued that fight, not because he sought recognition or reward, but because it was simply who he was, a man who had learned from his parents, his faith, and his own hard experience that the most powerful force in the world is truth spoken with courage and patience. And in Burkina Faso, in that courtroom that had witnessed such drama, in the hearts of people who had seen justice nearly destroyed and then miraculously preserved, his example lived on. A reminder that even in the darkest moments, even when power seems invincible and truth seems helpless, there are still those who will stand firm, still those who will wait for the right moment, still those who will sacrifice everything for the sake of what is right. The trial of Ibrahim Traoré had ended, but the story it told about courage, integrity, patience, and the ultimate triumph of truth would echo through generations, inspiring others to stand firm in their own moments of testing. And that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all.